Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Thomas, and I'm an editor for the online magazine RealitySandwich.com. I'm sitting here today with Randall Carlson, and we're going to be speaking about a topic that is kind of on the minds of a lot of people these days, which is climate change. More specifically, Randall's going to address some of the viewpoints he holds towards anthropogenic global warming, which is global warming caused by human activities, such as the burning of fossil fuels. Just a little bit of biographical information on Randall Carlson before we begin. Randall Carlson is an independent researcher, master builder, and high-ranking Freemason with over 35 years of investigations into the interface between ancient mysteries and modern science. So Randall, thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure. I'm honored to be here.
So it's interesting that your interest in climate change, very much predates the current debate that we're hearing about. So I think you have a kind of a unique perspective.
I was reading some of the original climatologists like Herman Flown and a number of others that are kind of now considered the founding fathers of the science in really back in the 70s and into the 80s. So when I heard in 1988 that there was going to be a UN-sponsored a major effort to try to unravel the mysteries of climate change, I thought, yes, this is very important.
So it's the IPCC?
Yes, well, this is probably before the IPCC was officially created, and essentially there was a series of meetings and testimonies before Congress and so forth discussing the need to study the climate and understand climate change. And at that time, by that time, I had concluded that natural climate change was of overriding importance to our future. However, by the time the first report came out, I was rather disappointed because I realized then that the entire focus of the effort was going to be strictly on human climate change, to the exclusion of natural climate change. Now, up to this point, I had become familiar with a lot of the research and the literature, studying ice cores, studying deep sea sediments, studying tree rings, dendrochronology. All of these sciences were just coming into the fore at that time. And it was becoming clear to anybody who looked at this that there had been extraordinary natural changes in climate. Even by the late 70s and early 80s, this was very apparent. And so I was disappointed when I realized that the entire focus was going to be strictly on the anthropogenic component of climate change.
So I wanted to mention this. I mean, it's like one thing you hear all the time these days from scientists and politicians and public figures, people who believe that humans are influencing the climate, is that it's a done deal. All the data is in, the debate is over, global warming is definitely being caused by our activities. So, I mean, obviously you don't share that sentiment.
Well, I do believe humans are influencing the climate.
Right, but you don't believe that this debate is over?
No, I absolutely don't believe it. In fact, the debate has really barely begun.
Right.
There are so many facets of environmental and climate change that we're just beginning to understand, and the roles of the various natural forces, both terrestrial and celestial, and how they interact, that no, the debate is not over as to the causes of climate change. And I think the whole scope of the discussion needs to be broadened considerably. And again, let me emphasize, I do believe humans are influencing the climate. The question becomes the human influence relative to the natural forces that we've already seen at work. That's the main question we need to look at.
So the IPCC, the UN assembled Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they claim to have this international consensus of scientists from different disciplines around the world who claim that that we are definitely influencing the climate with our activities. So what do you have to say to this consensus of international scientists?
I would say that yes, we're definitely influencing the climate. Just as us sitting here in this room, by breathing, we're influencing the climate of this room. Right. The question is how significant is that influence within the long term or within the big picture? And it's difficult for anyone who has not studied or looked into the natural vagaries of climate and environmental change to even have a context in which to have a meaningful discussion about it. My take on this is that essentially what you've got is you've got a research consortium that's being funded to the tune of about $3 to $4 billion a year. They've essentially hired scientists to come up with a foreordained conclusion that humans are influencing the climate, and to skew the research such that the focus shifts away from the natural forces, the sun, for example, which I believe is going to end up being probably the major factor in climate change once we've really begun to look at a lot of the data. So essentially, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which preceded the formation of the IPCC, set out a political mandate, which was essentially that they were going to create a research body to study the human relation or the human effects on climate change. And so with that mandate at the very start, it pretty much declared that the exclusion of all natural forces was going to be part of the process. And so I don't believe that it's really meaningful in the larger context.
So you find that the focus has been kind of hijacked on what we should be doing?
I think that's a good word to use, that it's been hijacked towards a preordained political agenda.
Okay. So, I wanted to ask you about this, which is climate change has become, one of the kind of top concerns for people who consider themselves to be environmentally minded. So, what about this? I mean, it can appear like people who argue against humans strongly influencing the climate are anti-environmentalist. I mean, the people that claim that it seems like they don't see any problems with pollution or, the way that we're kind of living on this planet. So where's the harm in believing in humans having a strong influence on global warming if it's benefiting the planet?
I think the operative term that you just used was strong influence. And see, that's what I would question. You see, what we've done is we've slightly enhanced a trace gas in the atmosphere. From roughly, the assumption is about 280 parts per million pre-industrial atmospheric concentrations of CO2 to about 370, 380 parts per million at present. The question should be, would a small increase in a trace gas in the atmosphere, which is about 0.03% of the atmosphere is actually carbon dioxide. And what we've done is we've so far, if you take the data at face value, we've perhaps increased the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by 80 to 90 parts per million. Well, if you think about 80 to 90 parts per million, that isn't a huge increase in the flux of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there are some atmospheric physicists who've questioned whether or not that really is enough to invoke substantial, noticeable changes in our climate. The argument has not been settled yet. In spite of the fact that the IPCC spokespeople are saying that the debate is over, no, there's plenty of debate about the actual role of a slight enhancement of CO2 in the atmosphere. The claim is also made that pre-industrial levels of CO2 in the atmosphere held steady for hundreds of thousands of years. And it all depends on which proxies you use. Now, a proxy is essentially an indirect way of trying to determine what an ancient climate would have been doing, temperature, for example, or the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there are a variety of proxies that can be used to try to reconstruct what ancient atmosphere or ancient temperature, et cetera, would have been. The IPCC exclusively uses ice core data. And ice core data shows that pre-industrial concentrations of CO2 have held steady for, literally, like I said, hundreds of thousands of years. Well, there's been plenty of objections to the idea of using exclusively ice core data. That ice core data may not be a true representation of what ancient atmospheric concentrations would have been. If you think about it, an ice core is taken from either usually the Greenland ice sheet or the South Polar ice sheet. Most of the ice cores that have been used to develop these proxies are either from one of those two sources. And if you go back to the Greenland ice sheet and you go back down 1,500 to 2,000 meters into the ice, and you take a thin layer and you extract a bubble of gas that's trapped in that ice, what you've done is you've extracted one ice core from one isolated spot on the planet. You go down 1,500, 2,000 meters, you take an air bubble and you look at it, and if it has 280 parts per million, do you then make the assumption that that air bubble with 280 parts per million of CO2 is now representative of the entire global atmosphere at that time, which may be 15 or 20 or 30,000 years ago, or even longer? And I think that's a big leap of faith to take.
But that's what the consensus of scientists are basing a lot of their claims
Well,
on.
again, the consensus, when you hear the word consensus, first let me say that, we've heard that there is a consensus, and we just need to state at the outset that science has nothing to do with consensus. It does not function by majority rule. It's not democratic. It relies strictly on the facts and on the evidence and on critical thinking. Consensus, the word consensus is meaningless when you're talking about science. Now, if you actually go to the IPCC reports that they put out and read the scientific articles that they have assembled together, they cover the gamut of all facets of climate change, including climate change relative to a particular species of insect or frog or plant, or the variety of topics is tremendous. Well, if you actually go through and sift through some of that literature, what you'll find is that there's actually very little consensus in there. The consensus comes in the summary for policymakers, which is written essentially by government bureaucrats. Summary for policymakers is essentially culling off the research of the 1,500 roughly scientists that have been employed in this process, selectively choosing what material, what research is going to be emphasized, what is going to be neglected, and so forth, to put together these summaries for policymakers. Essentially, when these bureaucrats get together to perform this process, they have agreed ahead of time that their procedure is going to be to arrive at a consensus. So they selectively go through the literature and essentially engineer a consensus that then emerges into the summary for policymakers that's now read by, congressmen and lawmakers and other interested bodies, non-governmental organizations and so forth, that are trusting that that summary for policymakers is going to be an accurate reflection of the actual science. Now, so what I'm saying is that even within the IPCC itself, there is dissent and discussion and disagreement. Now, you've got roughly 1,500 scientists working in that process. Now, if you come outside of that process, you have thousands of other scientists who are not within the IPCC organization. Now, when you go into what they have been doing, you discover that the perspectives are completely, the points of view are completely across the spectrum. From, yes, humans are about to induce a catastrophic climate change, to no, humans are having a negligible effect on the climate. So the point here, I think, to make is that, no, there's not a consensus, and the debate is not over, because we are just at the very infancy of learning and studying about how the climate of this planet works.
So where do you find your biggest dispute then with the tenets of human-caused global warming? I mean, are any of the claims they make true?
Yes. I mean, the idea that we are increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, I mean, through fossil fuel burning, we're dumping about 5.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every single year. 5.5 billion tons. In scientific lingo, that's called a gigaton. So we've got 5.5 gigatons of fossil fuel-derived CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere every single year. Well, but the context you have to place that in is how much CO2 is naturally being cycled through as a result of photosynthesis and respiration and so forth. And what you discover is that the human contribution of CO2 is actually quite insignificant relative to what nature is pumping through the cycle every year anyway. You've got around, again, I said 5.5 gigatons from the fossil fuel reservoir, which I think the latest estimate is that there might be about 4,000 gigatons in the fossil fuel reservoir, which is shaky because we don't really know the full extent of the oil and coal deposits and so forth. In the soil, there's about 1,500 gigatons, as opposed to, again, 5.5 gigatons. In the atmosphere, there's about 750 gigatons at any given one time. In the ocean, or in the plants, in the plant sphere, there's roughly 610 gigatons. In the ocean, there's about 38,000 gigatons. And every year, it's unknown, but it's guessed that at least 200 to 300 gigatons are transferred between these various reservoirs every year. In the marine sediments and sedimentary rocks, there turns out that there's about 100 million gigatons of carbon locked up. How did that get there? It must have at one time, at least a fair percentage of it must have one time been in the atmosphere. And if we basically look at the climatic history of the planet, we discover that the Quaternary, which is the period we're in right now, is anomalously cold relative to the long-term view of climate. The current concentrations of CO2 are relatively low compared to what they were back in the, for example, in the early Cenozoic or the late Mesozoic.
Right now, they're lower than they have been?
Yes, I mean, they were back to, at least 1,000 parts per million.
Isn't that run counter to like some of the most common claims you hear from those who are proponents of human-caused global warming about the levels of CO2 now being greater than they ever have been?
Well, let's go back again to the point about the ice core proxies, because the claim has been made, or the assumption has been made, that ice cores represent a true and accurate picture of average global CO2 concentrations in the past. This has been challenged by some leading glaciologists who have been involved for decades in the extraction of ice cores and the study of gas inclusions within those ice cores. And essentially what they're saying is that in the extraction of the core, which if you're bringing a core up from 1,000 meters down, it's under a tremendous amount of pressure. And as that core is extracted, it undergoes depressurization, which causes thousands of hairline cracks throughout the ice core. The question has been raised as to whether or not the amount of gas entrained within an air inclusion, trapped and within that ice, is actually a true and accurate representation of the average global concentration. The questioning has arisen because the claim has been made that in the extraction of the ice core, there's significant outgassing that occurs, which would then bias the pre-industrial concentrations to being much lower than they actually are. There are other proxies, for example, from the stomata of plants, which is also a direct indication of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and they show that concentrations have quite frequently been higher than now. Actual chemical sampling of the air, chemists have been able to actually analyze the chemical constitution of the air within about 1 or 2% accuracy since the early 19th century. And during the almost 200 years since chemists were first able to analyze the atmosphere, there's been over 90,000 direct samples of the atmosphere. And what is the percentages of the various gases that are in the atmosphere?
How far back are we going?
We're going back about 200 years now.
So just in the last 200 years?
In the last 200 years, actual sampling of the actual atmosphere shows that the concentrations sometimes have exceeded 500 parts per million.
But what we hear from the proponents of human-caused global warming is that it's never that pre-industrial was about around 280, and it's never been higher.
Yes, that's what's claimed. That's what's claimed in An Inconvenient Truth. In An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore states categorically that the CO2 concentrations have never risen above 300 parts per million.
But you're saying that there's peer-reviewed data?
Peer-reviewed literature that's available to anybody, and we can make all of those references and resources available to anybody who wants to look into this further. Yes, I mean, we've got nearly 2 centuries of direct chemical analysis of the composition of the atmosphere. That is pretty much completely excluded.
So as a starting point, because I think the CO2 argument is kind of foundational for those who argue that.
Yes, it is.
So as a starting point, that's just that's a really strong kind of contradiction in the science. I mean, so I wonder how the message has gotten across the world to all these political and scientific bodies that this is an undisputed fact, and when seems that you're saying it's, very to the contrary of lots of other data.
Yeah, well, yes. There's again the scenario is that when we look at ice cores, we get one picture. When we use other proxies or direct chemical analysis of the actual atmosphere, it creates an entirely different
So
picture.
the ice core method is problematic, and that's the one that has been chosen
they rely
to
on.
rely. Okay.
Yes.